As understanding, Dasein projects its being upon possibility. This being toward possibilities saying zu Möglichkeit that understands is itself a potentiality for being sein können, because of the way these disclosed possibilities come back to Dasein. The project of understanding has its own possibility of development. We shall call the development of understanding interpretation Auslegung. In interpretation, understanding appropriates what it has understood understanding. In interpretation, understanding does not become something different, but rather itself. Interpretation is existentially based in understanding, and not the other way around. Interpretation is not the acknowledgement of what has been understood, but rather the development of possibilities projected in understanding. In accordance with the train of these preparatory analyses of everyday Dasein, we shall pursue the phenomenon of interpretation in the understanding of the world, that is, in inauthentic understanding in the mode of its genuineness. In terms of the significance of what is disclosed in understanding the world, the being of taking care of what is at hand learns to understand what the relevance can be with what is actually encountered. This means that circumspection discovers that the world which has already been understood is interpreted. What is at hand comes explicitly before sight that understands. All preparing, arranging, setting right, improving, rounding out, occur in such a way that things at hand for circumspection are taken apart in their in order to, and are taken care of according to what has become visible in this way. What has been circumspectly taken apart with regard to its in order to as such, what has been explicitly understood, has the structure of something as something. The circumspectly interpretive answer to the circumspect question of what this particular thing at hand is runs, it is for. Saying what it is for is not simply naming something, but what is named is understood as that as which what is in question is to be taken. What is disclosed in understanding, what is understood, is always already accessible in such a way that in it it's, as what, can be explicitly delineated. The as constitutes the structure of the explicitness of what is understood, it constitutes the interpretation. The circumspect, interpretive dealing with what is at hand in the surrounding world which sees this as a table, a door, a car, a bridge does not necessarily already have to analyze what is circumspectly interpreted in a particular statement. Any simple prepredicative seeing of what is at hand is in itself already understanding and interpretive. But does not the lack of this, as, constitute the simplicity of a mere perception of something? The seeing of this sight is always already understanding and interpreting. It contains in itself the explicitness of referential relations, of the in order to, which belong to the totality of relevance in terms of which what is simply encountered is understood. The articulation of what is understood in the interpreting approach to beings guided by the something as something lies before a thematic statement about it. The as does not first show up in the statement, but is only first stated, which is possible only because it is there as something to be stated. The fact that the explicitness of a statement can be lacking in simple looking does not justify us in denying every articulate interpretation, and thus the as structure, to this simple seeing. The simple seeing of things nearest to us and our having to do with, contains the structure of interpretation so primordially that a grasping of something which is, so to speak, free of the as requires a kind of reorientation. When we just stare at something, our just having it before us lies before us as a failure to understand it anymore. This grasping which is free of the as is a privation of simple seeing, which understands. It is not more primordial than the latter, but derived from it. The ontic inexplicitness of the as must not mislead us into overlooking it as the a priori existential constitution of understanding. But if any perception of useful things at hand always understands and interprets them, letting them be circumspectly encountered as something, does this not then mean that initially something merely objectively present is experience which then is understood as a door, as a house? That would be a misunderstanding of the specific disclosive function of interpretation. Interpretation does not, so to speak, throw a significance over what is nakedly objectively present and does not stick a value on it. But what is encountered in the world is always already in a relevance which is disclosed in the understanding of world, a relevance which is made explicit by interpretation. Things at hand are always already understood in terms of a totality of relevance. This totality need not be explicitly grasped by a thematic interpretation. Even if this totality of relevance has undergone such an interpretation, it recedes again into an undifferentiated understanding. It is precisely in this modality that it is the essential foundation of everyday, circumspect interpretation. This is always based on a Vorhaving Vorheit, as the appropriation of understanding and being sane that understands. The interpretation operates in being toward a totality of relevance which has already been understood. When something is understood but still veiled, it becomes unveiled and thulung by an act of appropriation that is always done under the guidance of a perspective which fixes that with regard to which what has been understood is to be interpreted. In each instance Jules, the interpretation is grounded in a foresight Vorsicht that approaches, ancinated, what has been taken in Vorhaving with a definite interpretation in view. What is held in the Vorhaving and understood in a foreseeing view becomes comprehensible through the interpretation. The interpretation can draw the conceptuality belonging to the beings to be interpreted from these themselves, or else the interpretation can force those beings into concepts to which they are opposed in accordance with their kind of being. The interpretation has always already decided, finally or provisionally, upon a definite conceptuality. It is grounded in a foreconception Vorgriff 1. The interpretation of something as something is essentially grounded in Vorhaving, foresight, and foreconception. Interpretation is never a presuppositionless grasping of something previously given. When a specific instance of interpretation, in the sense of a precise textual interpretation, appeals to what is there, das state, then that which initially is there is nothing other than the self-evident, undiscussed prejudice Vormeinung of the interpreter which necessarily lies in every interpretive approach as that which is already posited, with interpretation in general, namely, that which is pre-given Vorgegeben in Vorhaving, foresight, and foreconception. How are we to conceive the character of this for? Have we done this when we formally say a priori? Why is this structure appropriate to understanding, which we have characterized as a fundamental existential of Dasein? How is the structure of the as, which belongs to what is interpreted as such related to the forestructure? This phenomenon is obviously not to be dissolved into pieces, but is a primordial analytic to be ruled out. Should we accept such phenomena as finality? Then the question would remain, why? Or do the forestructure of understanding and the as structure of interpretation show an existential ontological connection with the phenomenon of project? And does this phenomenon refer back to a primordial constitution of being of Dasein? For answering these questions, for which the preparation up to this point is not at all sufficient, we must inquire whether what is visible as the forestructure of understanding and the as structure of interpretation does not itself already represent a unitary phenomenon which has been used extensively in philosophical problematics, without what is used so universally measuring up to the primordiality of ontological explication. In the projecting of understanding, beings are disclosed in their possibility. The character of possibility always corresponds to the kind of being of the beings understood. Interworldly beings in general are projected upon the world, that is, upon a totality of significance in whose referential relations taking care, as being in the world, has rooted itself from the beginning. When interworldly beings are discovered along with the being of Dasein, that is, when they become intelligible, we say that they have meaning sin. But strictly speaking, what is understood is not the meaning but being siend or being sane. Meaning is that wherein the intelligibility of something maintains itself. That which can be articulated in disclosure, that understands we call meaning. The concept of meaning includes the formal framework of what necessarily belongs to what interpretation that understands articulates. Meaning, structured by Vorhaving, foresight, and foreconception, is the upon which of the project in terms of which something becomes intelligible as something. Insofar as understanding and interpretation constitute the existential constitution of the being of the there, meaning must be conceived as the formal, existential framework of the disclosedness belonging to understand. Meaning is an existential of Dasein, not a property that is attached to beings, which lies behind them or floats somewhere as a realm between. Only Dasein has meaning in that the disclosedness of being in the world can be fulfilled through the beings discoverable in it. Thus only Dasein can be meaningful or meaningless. This means its own being and the beings disclosed with that being can be appropriated in understanding Verständnis, or they can be confined to incomprehensibility unverständnis. This interpretation of the concept of meaning is fundamentally ontological existential. If we adhere to it, then all beings whose mode of being is unlike Dasein must be understood as unsinniges, as essentially bare of meaning as such. Does not mean here a value judgment, but expresses an ontological determination. And only what is unmeaningful can be absurd widersinnig. Objectively present things encountered in Dasein can, so to speak, assault its being sane, for example, events of nature which break in on us and destroy us. And when we ask about the meaning of being, our inquiry does not become profound and does not brood on anything which stands behind being, but questions being itself in so far as it stands within the intelligibility of Dasein. The meaning of being can never be contrasted with beings, or with being as the supporting ground of beings, for ground is only accessible as meaning, even if that meaning itself is an abyss abgrund of meaninglessness. As the disclosedness of the there, understanding always concerns the whole of being in the world. In every understanding of world, existence is also understood, and vice versa. Furthermore, every interpretation operates within the forestructure which we characterize. Every interpretation which is to contribute some understanding must already have understood what is to be interpreted. This fact has always already been noticed, even if only in the realm of derivative ways of understanding and interpretation, in philological interpretation. The latter belongs to the scope of scientific cognition. Such cognition demands the rigor of demonstration giving reason. Scientific proof must not already presuppose what its task is to found. But if interpretation always already has to operate within what is understood and nurture itself from this, how should it then produce scientific results without going in a circle, especially when the presupposed understanding still operates in the common knowledge of human being and world? But according to the most elementary rules of logic, the circle is a circulus vitias. If this is so, then the business of historical interpretation is thus banned a priori from the realm of rigorous knowledge. If the fact of the circle in understanding is not eliminated, historiography must be content with less rigorous possibilities of knowledge. It is permitted to compensate for this defect to some extent with the spiritual significance of its object. But even according to the opinion of historiographers themselves, it would be more ideal if the circle could be avoided, and if there were the hope of finally creating a historiography which is as independent of the standpoint of the observer as the knowledge of nature is supposed to be. But to see a vitiosum in this circle, and to look for ways to avoid it, even to feel that it is an inevitable imperfection, is to misunderstand understanding from the ground up. It is not a matter of assimilating understanding and interpretation to a particular ideal of knowledge, which is itself only a degeneration of understanding that has strayed into the legitimate grasping of what is objectively present in its essential unintelligibility. Rather, the fulfillment of the fundamental conditions of possible interpretation lies in not failing to recognize beforehand the essential conditions of its being done. What is decisive is not to get out of the circle, but to get in it in the right way. This circle of understanding is not a circle in which any random kind of knowledge operates, but it is rather the expression of the existential forestructure of Dasein itself. The circle must not be degraded to vitiosum, not even to tolerated one. Positive possibility of the most primordial knowledge is hidden in it, which, however, is only grasped in a genuine way when interpretation has understood that its first, constant, and last task is not to let forehaving, foresight, and foreconception be given to it by chance ideas and popular conceptions, but to guarantee the scientific theme by developing these in terms of the things themselves. Because, in accordance with its existential meaning, understanding is the potentiality for being of Dasein itself. The ontological presuppositions of historical historischer knowledge transcend in principle the idea of rigor of the most exact sciences. Mathematics is not more exact than history, but only narrower with regard to the scope of the existential foundations relevant to it. The circle in understanding belongs to the structure of meaning, and this phenomenon is rooted in the existential constitution of Dasein, that is, in interpretive understanding. Beings which, as being in the world, are concerned about their being itself have an ontological structure of the circle. However, if we note that the circle belongs ontologically to a kind of being of objective presence, subsistence, we shall in general have to avoid characterizing something like Dasein ontologically with this phenomenon.